So, like I said, cameras don't like to have too much black or too much white. They like to have a balance in the middle. So it's auto-adjusting a couple of things. It's auto that we're going to talk about. It's auto-adjusting the aperture, the same way that your own pupils adjust in a dark room or a bright sunny day. They get bigger or smaller to make more or less light come in. It's adjusting the shutter speed, how long it's gathering light for each frame, and it's adjusting its ISO, how sensitive the sensor is, to get this kind of bland image. But this isn't the image I want, right? I want to take more control to get the image I want, which is going to be a much darker image. So I've thrown my camera into manual exposure, and I adjust those settings, the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO, and I can get an image that looks like this, right? A much more dramatic and cool looking image. This is what I wanted. Now you see that the area that was kind of blown out white in the previous image is exposed correctly. The rest of the image falls to black. I could be anywhere. I could be standing on the moon for all we know. You can't see the rest of the room. But the camera would not like this, right? The camera would say there was way too much black here, and there's no pure white, right? This is kind of maybe right there, maybe those pixels right there, but there's way too much black. A camera would never let this happen in auto. So this is why we need manual. We need manual to get images like this, right? Otherwise the camera's always going to kind of balance, kind of give us this middle ground image. The same thing goes for the other end of the spectrum, right? If you want to make things look really bright. So here, maybe I want to make myself look like I'm floating in a white space, like a dream or something. But the camera says, well, that's a lot of white. I better darken it down. It's too bright, right? It's looking for that middle ground image. But if I adjust, boom, right? Now I could be, in a dream, talking with the angels or whatever. It looks like I'm just kind of floating in this white space because I've adjusted the aperture and the shutter speed to be what I want. The other really nice thing about putting things in manual exposure is the exposure doesn't shift as the contents of the scene shift, right? Before, in auto, if we had a shot like this in the entryway and the door opens, right, well, all of a sudden the entryway becomes dark. And then, right, because the aperture is closing down, and then when the sun goes away, it kind of slowly brightens back up, right? And that's not something, maybe I don't want the camera making its own decisions mid-shot, which can ruin split screens or can ruin pop cuts or other effects because the lighting conditions are changing between shots. If you put your camera in manual, it's going to be what it is, what it is, what it is. It's not going to adjust the shutter speed. Those things are locked until you change them. All right, so these are reasons that we want to be in manual mode. So here's how it works. Let's get our camera here. All right, so a little bit tight for space here. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see that there's a little M next to our camera icon. Now that's how we know we're in manual mode. I'll have it set like that for you. It's the first setting in the menu. So the red one, you see shooting mode, is either auto movie exposure, movie mode in which the shutter speed and aperture are automatically set, or movie manual exposure, which you can set the shutter speed and aperture. So that's how I'm going to deliver the cameras to you every day. Now there's three numbers that make up what they call the exposure triangle. That's what makes manual exposure work. And that's right here, and right here. So the first one we're going to talk about, the first part of the exposure triangle, is shutter speed. And shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So the slowest shutter speed, so shutter speed goes from slow to fast. Slow being 1/25. And that means that the shutter is gathering light for a 25th of a second for that frame. And then the next frame that happens, which is in a 25th of a second, it gathers light for a 25th of a second. So it's gathering light for a really long time, basically the entire length of every frame it's gathering light for. Now on the other end of that spectrum, stay awake, camera. if I wake up, off and on again. Come on. Thank you. If I spin my little wheel on the top here, or honestly, you guys will just be able to use the touch screen. I can't use it because it turns the touch screen off when you connect the projector. But if I spin this, you see that as the number gets higher, the image gets darker and darker and darker, right? I can go all the way up to a 4,000th of a second, and basically you're only seeing, like if I point up at the projector and lights, right? So the other end of the spectrum, 1/4,000th of a second. So at 1/25th of a second, we have a very bright image, and at 1/4000th of a second, we have a very dark image because it's only gathering light for 1/4000th of a second, and then stopping its light gathering. And then the next frame, it's gathering light for 1/4000th of a second, and then stopping its light gathering. Do this so you guys can see a little bit. You can also see, I'm going to turn this down just a little bit, maybe go to like 2,000th of a second. You can see that at a fast shutter speed, like a 1/1600th of a second, it's got this very like choppy look to it when I pan around the room. Whereas if I go back down to our 25th of a second, and let me just darken things up so you can see, when I pan around the room, it's got a very blurry and smooth feel to it, right? So not only does shutter speed affect how bright or how dark the image is, it also affects kind of motion and the way it looks. So I like to say that a slow shutter speed gives you smooth motion, whereas a 4,000th of a second gives you choppy motion. And these are things that you want to think about as a filmmaker, right? Am I filming like a dance concert with like fluid, beautiful, flowing movements? Probably going to want to shoot that with a slow shutter speed. Am I filming, an action chase scene with people like sprinting down the hallways trying to chase one another? That might look good with a choppy shutter speed. Am I shooting kind of a romantic, dramatic scene? Probably want to go with a smooth shutter speed. Am I filming some like life-changing, realization moment or something like that? Probably want to go with maybe that choppy shutter speed, or split the difference and kind of put it in the middle. It doesn't really matter. But that's something that you have to decide what you want it to be, kind of before you press record. All right. So that's the first part of the exposure triangle, right? If I have a slow shutter speed, things are very bright. But then as I speed my shutter speed up, things get very, very dark. Now inside, it's basically so dark that we can't see very much anything. Outside in the sun, you would probably still be able to see some things. Okay. The second number that we're paying attention to, this one right here, is our aperture. And that one is not a length of time, a measurement of time. That one is a measurement of how wide or how small the aperture, like your pupil, is on the lens. So at f, let's bring this shutter speed down to like a manageable number here, kind of somewhere in the middle. At f4.5, our aperture is pretty wide. In fact, I think this camera can actually open up to, if we're all the way zoomed out, you can open all the way up to 3.5. So they're called f-stops. I don't know why it's the letter F, I forgot. f3.5 is actually a very open and bright aperture. Whereas if I spin my little wheel now, and you'll see as the number gets higher, the image is going to be getting darker and darker and darker because I am making the aperture tinier and tinier and tinier until it's just a little pinhole. I think if you zoom in, you can actually get this thing down to f40. We'll just kind of split the difference. We'll call it f25. It's closed and dark. Okay, so a small number means big open hole, lots of light, a big number, like 25, 22, 40, something like that, means a tiny hole, and it's going to be dark. We call it, you say open your aperture or close your aperture, and that's how you can control your image. Now, the same way that shutter speed, yeah, it does light, but it also kind of made things choppy or smooth. Aperture has a secondary thing that it does as well. So with aperture, if I put this, let's open this aperture all the way up as bright as I can go. Make this a little more correct. Now you'll see that I can only focus, where's my auto manual focus, right? That I have just the pen in focus and nothing else in focus. But if I adjust my aperture to a small number, brighten this up, you'll see that the whole shot is in focus now, right? So when you have an open and bright aperture, you have shallow focus. When you have a closed dark aperture, you have deep focus, right? The pen and the wall are in focus, right, all the way back. Whereas if I flip-flop those values, right, do this like this, right, now only the pen is in focus. So when you want those beautiful, romantic, dramatic scenes, right, if you really want to control your viewer's eye, only let them see one thing, have the rest of the scene in bokeh, right? You may have seen that term on the phone's portrait mode, right? Bokeh with the H, right? This is the quality of the bokeh, is the style in which it blurs. You want that for dramatic stuff. You want that so that viewers' eyes can only focus on one thing. You can even shift it, right? Like they always talk about the commercials on the new phone. You can shift, you can rack that focus from one location to the other. You're going to need that wide open aperture to do that. If you've got a closed aperture, it's not going to work, but that's nice too, right? If you're doing that running chasing scene, if you're doing an action sequence with characters doing a lot of motion to and from the camera, and you don't always have to be chasing them and having the focus shift, deep focus might save you, right? You want to see something, you want to see kind of over the shoulder of my main character and see them seeing something far out in the distance, deep focus, right? Citizen Kane made deep focus famous. You can use, all of these things have their own kind of uses and reasons for being. You've got to decide as the cinematographer and the director when we're going to use what for what effect, right? Okay, so aperture, you can just use the touchscreen. When you guys practice today, you'll see that using the touchscreen is a lot easier than using the dial ring. It's a lot more complicated button press. It's really easy to just use the touchscreen and slide the values around. All right, the third part of the exposure triangle, because they all work together to adjust the amount of light you're using, is this one over here, and that's the ISO. Okay, so if I have a low ISO, like 200, it's going to be dark. And conversely, if I throw my ISO up really high, 12,800 on this camera, it's bright. Now what ISO is doing is it's how sensitive this sensor is, right? Photons are hitting the sensor with a certain amount of energy. And at 200, it takes a lot of energy to make that sensor record anything, right? It's not a very sensitive sensor, right? So it takes a lot of energy to make something fire off. If I shorten my shutter speed down here, we can get some usable image, right? There we go. Right, so at 200, yeah, or excuse me, ISO 320, it's happening. But I can make my sensor more sensitive, right? And now it takes much less energy for the photons to activate that sensor. So a high gives it a bright value. But here's the problem. When you make a sensor very sensitive like this, it starts to record things that aren't really there. It starts to get a lot of garbage. It starts to get a lot of electrical noise. It starts to get a lot of phantom signals. You've probably seen this, especially, I mean, they've gotten phones and cameras have obviously gotten better at this over the years. That's one of the biggest advances, is having your sensors be better. But you take a photo at night on your phone, it looks grainy, it looks bad, right? Because your phone's trying to amplify its sensitivity so much, it's getting a lot of stuff that's not really there. So the difference is, this is good image quality at ISO 200, and this is bad image quality at ISO 12,800. Right? So our goal is always to shoot with the least amount of ISO that we possibly can in a space. So that means in here, turning on both light switches, maybe even using some other lights. Right? We've talked about it before. You want to shoot a nighttime scene? Don't turn all the lights off. Light it blue, light with some light, and then use Premiere to make it darker, right? That way we can keep our ISO low and have a good image quality. So I can bring my ISO down and get a pretty decent image. You know, ISO 1000, ISO 800 usually, 600 is where I can be in this classroom. Now, how do you know, now that we're kind of doing this job ourselves, how do we know when we have a good image? Right? When you're outside in a sunny day and the screen's hard to read. Well, that's where this thing right here, this histogram, is going to become our friend. And there's also a little meter that when you push a button shows up for a couple seconds, that becomes your friend. So if you just want kind of a nice, normally exposed shot, you know, I can look at you guys and I see that that histogram is kind of nicely balanced. There's some pixels on the left and some pixels on the right. If I make it really dark, right, you see that it spikes, lots of black pixels. Or if I put a lot of white in the image, see it spikes on the right, too many white pixels, too bright. If I look down here, you guys, it's a nice, even dispersal of pixels. So I'm like, okay, this is a good, well-exposed shot. The other thing that, like I said, that little meter in the middle, if you tap the photo button, it comes up. This is saying that I'm still a little bit bright. So you see how there's negative numbers and positive numbers? This little hash mark here, this little rectangle will automatically adjust. See, I go up to the bright ceiling, it says, whoa, you're way too bright. I go down here, right, and it says, oh, you're way too dark being here under the desk. Right, it's down to the negatives. And look at you guys, still says I'm a little bright, so maybe I'll, as I get a little bit darker with my aperture, see, it's that little rectangle starts to adjust. So I want to try and get to hit in the middle. I think you guys look good right about there. It's probably seeing a lot of light up in the rafters there. So maybe if we come down like this. There we go. See? So now I've got a nice kind of even dispersal of pixels. My meter's in the middle. That's how I know I've got a good, well-exposed shot. I'm basically, it's my slowest shutter speed. I've got my aperture basically as open as it can go because it's pretty dark in here. And I got my ISO about 640. If I wanted to try and speed my shutter speed up, so I want a choppier shot, right? I want to like induce some panic. Maybe you guys are going to, like there's a fire drill, you guys start freaking out. I'm going to have to get some ISO in here or get some more lights in here to get that shot. Now it's going to have like when people start running around, right? It's going to be panicky and crazy and wild, and that'll be good. I don't want smooth and dreamy for a freak out fire alarm sequence, right? Or I could try and maybe bring some more lights in here. Because if I try to go any higher than that, basically my only hope is to get more lights. There's nothing else I can do. I can't really get my aperture open anymore. All right. Let's see here. I'll show you guys a couple other examples that I shot on the computer so you can really see the shutter speed in action and the aperture in action. So here's one at a 30th of a second, so a really slow shutter speed, right? If you're shooting 30 frames a second video, right, like standard video, then a 30th of a second. We've been shooting in 24 frames a second, which is a little more cinematic, so you can bring your shutter speed down that low. If you're shooting in 60 frames a second or 120 because you want that super slow-mo, then your shutter speed is that should be minimum. But you see here at 30 frames, a 30th of a second, the water droplets are here even in slow motion. They're streaks, right? Because in a 30th of a second, that droplet of water moves a good amount, right? 30th of a second is a pretty long time. Whereas if I crank my shutter speed to a 4,000th of a second, right, and then we whip the hose out, you'll see that no longer are they streaks, they're individual drops now, right? Because in a 4,000th of a second, a droplet of water can't move that far. I like to use fast shutter speeds for pretty much all the outdoor sports because you get really defined movements. Like I think water polo and swimming look great because you get the droplets of water. Track looks cool in a super fast shutter speed. Here's the aperture. So at f22, like I said, it doesn't really matter how far away I walk. I'm still going to be in focus. You can see even the gym way back here is in focus. And then right away you're going to tell, because this is with one of the lenses that was absconded with, it could open all the way to f1.5. So you could really blur things like crazy. You can see, it's kind of wild, you can actually see on the concrete where what's in focus is like coming closer and closer and closer until the pen is in focus and everything else just falls away. Those lenses had such great depth of field to them, and I'm trying to get some see, and you can see the focus walk down the concrete, and then I'm in focus. So if you've got your aperture wide open, you can get shots like that as well. And then ISO, here's what I did is I split screen this. So there's a line, you'll see when the video plays because the plants don't line up. This half of the image has a nice low ISO with good image quality. And then this, the right half of the image, has the high ISO with the bad image quality. And you can see how it's like dancing and the pixels are kind of ugly. The greens don't look good. And over here, it's just nice and quiet and good, right? The dirt is really probably the biggest difference, honestly. But yeah. You want to always be thinking, how can I get that ISO, right, this ugly graininess to go away? Granted, that was with the old cameras, and these are going to have much better ISO reproduction, so I'm hoping it won't be that stark of a difference, but it's just always a good habit to get into to not have your ISO any higher than it needs to be for the shot we were trying to achieve. So those are the three numbers that you have to pay attention to when you are in manual exposure as a camera operator. You have to be thinking, do we want to shoot this smooth or choppy? Do I want deep or shallow focus? How can I keep my ISO low so that I don't introduce any bad image quality that I don't want? And then always, of course, making sure that the image is exposed correctly. It's not too bright or too dark, because that will ruin a movie also. That's why cinematographers and camera operators make a lot of money, because it's kind of a lot of things to think about, but it definitely results in a much better looking product than just letting the camera be an auto and kind of do it itself. So we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 19. That's funny, I had 19 this morning also. 19, so we're going to get in groups of 3 with one group of 4, and we will practice some shots today. So what we're going to do, hit the light, one light for me, Sumara, please, is each person, how can I get rid of this? Each person is going to shoot 6 shots. One at 1/30th shutter speed, and one at 1/4000th shutter speed. And if you do like a whip pan on these, right? Fast movement with the camera, or even just do a little bit of trucking or dollying, you'll really see the difference that the shutter speed makes to camera movement, or if you have an actor run through the scene really quick, just run through, it doesn't really matter what they're doing. Just something with motion so that you can see how shutter speed affects movement on camera. We're going to shoot one at f3.5 and one at f22 aperture. And do some rack focusing. And you'll see how at f22 there's really not much to rack. And at f3.5 there will be a lot to rack. One thing to keep note of is that if you zoom in with your camera, it becomes a new minimum. So when I'm all the way zoomed out, I can open my aperture to 3.5. But if I zoom in, the new maximum aperture becomes 6.3. Because, right, it's got that big hole, right? And then the lens is in front of it, and it's big. But then when you zoom in, you're basically doing this, right, to an image. And so that's as big as the hole can be now, right? Even if the hole is f3.5, if I'm zoomed in this much, well, only this much light's going to hit the sensor. So don't freak out and be like, Mr. Wolf, it won't go to 3.5. I'll just say, hey, you're zoomed in. Just zoom out, and it'll adjust. And then shoot one at ISO 200 and one at ISO 12,800. Try and do some with some color, and that way you can see on the computer if there's some quality difference there. And then we'll make a folder called manual exposure. On your slate, just make sure that you have your name and maybe just write like 130, 1/4000, f3.5, write whatever shot you're doing. You don't even have to put them in Premiere then. As long as your name is on the slate and the shot that you're working on, you know, this little section here is on the slate, so I know which one you're trying to do. You don't even have to edit them. I'll just look at the raw footage and we'll call it a day. And that way, like I said, each person needs to do their own. That way you get practice adjusting the values, seeing how you change the shutter speed, how you change the aperture and the ISO. Like I said, it's all touch screen on the back. It's really easy. And we've got a little under an hour to do this, and there's only going to be 3 people a group, 4 people for one group. So we're looking at like 15 to 20 minutes a person to get 6 shots. So that's plenty of time. We're just going to stay right here in our quad, and I'll be out there to help you if you have any questions. Do you have any questions yet, or do we want to get out there and start messing around first? Okay, so let's do this for groups, because I want to do groups of 3 and we'll do the 4. So we'll do, you guys will be my 4 right there. Do you 3 right here, you 3 right there. We'll do you 3 like this. We'll do, I kind of messed that up, but it's okay. We'll do Belle, Rosalie, and Josh, and then you 3. Sound good? All right, send someone to come grab a camera. I'm going to erase them, throw fresh batteries in, and then you guys can go start practicing.
I think that's when you switches the focus. Now 30, 90. You have 2 things, right? You switches.
That?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
pretty
I
sure.
was like going with the
Sorry.
Oh, like kind of. Oh, so I saw it. Yeah.
Just do the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. They all
Same
like be changing.
Wow, I'm pretty sure they're getting it.
I gotta use that. Why is that camera just? I think he's recording for.